It's really critical that we're prioritizing our relationships, that we're not taking them for granted, that we are learning how to turn towards one another, how to communicate with one another, how to have each other's back when it does get difficult.
The military lifestyle is all-encompassing.
It's difficult but rewarding.
Dynamic. Very, very dynamic.
Unpredictable.
You are in the Canadian Armed Forces or a family member connected to the military. You know the lifestyle can be a challenge.
The military lifestyle is always changing.
In this podcast, we explore the world of deployments, postings, and transitions. This is the military lifestyle. Here's your host, John Shaboon.
Relationships are great, but they're not always easy. Got to make time for each other, got to communicate. If you're in a relationship with a military member, in the context of the lifestyle, it's just more complex. Holly Flower, a social worker and counselor with the Esquimalt MFRC, is here to talk about healthy relationships next. Today, we're talking with Holly Flower, member of the Family Wellness and Counseling Team at the Esquimalt MFRC.
That's right. We're the Family Wellness and Counseling Team.
Yeah. Thank you for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
We're here to talk about healthy relationships. What are some characteristics of a healthy relationship?
Well, it's interesting. I think I might start first with the reality. I think social media and stories that we're told as children and the fairy tales portray an image of what a healthy relationship might be that for most of us, it's just not accurate. In my mind, a healthy relationship becomes more apparent when we're really, really in the mess of life. And so what I mean by that is, after the first deployment or a posting, or if a baby comes, or if there's financial struggles, which is part of the reality of people's lives, how does a relationship feel? What do people do when it's really, in those difficult times? Do they turn towards each other? Do they create a sense of equality and respect between one another? Do they feel safe? Do they feel psychologically, physically, sexually, spiritually? Do they feel safe within their relationship? I'm often looking at the emotional climate. When you go home, are you feeling supported? Is that your safe spot? Is that the place when you've had a tough day that you can go and turn towards your intimate partner and think, that person sees me, that person gets me, this person can help me feel a bit better, and I can do that for them as well.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. It's almost, there's an analogy of you're only as strong as your weakest day or something. I'm butchering that. I'm not sure what it is. So can I give me like an idea if we're like doing good, or if there's signs of trouble, or if there's something like it's kind of really bad? You were talking like the relationship feel is like that safety. It sounds like it's really important, and just that trust.
For sure. And we're all human beings, and we're all going to have days where, maybe we haven't had as much sleep. Maybe work was incredibly stressful. And so the way in which we show up with our partner is not maybe our ideal. For me, that's less of an indicator of what's happening in the relationship. It's more about what happens when we're having those difficult days. What do we do with our angst and our difficulty? Are we able to turn to our partners and feel safe? Do we feel like we're equal in that partnership? Do we feel like if we express what's happening for us, that we'll be ridiculed, shut down, that there's even a place to express that? So when you say, what are some indicators? What are some things to watch for? People will argue and have disagreements. There will be conflict. That is a regular part of life. Conflict in and of itself isn't a problem. It's what we do with the conflict. Do we ever feel frightened? Do we ever feel like we're walking on eggshells? When we think of our partner, do we think about or worry about, oh my gosh, what will their reaction be today? What will their reaction be if my child makes a sound? That for me is an indicator that things need to be looked at and paid attention to.
When people talk with each other, is there certain things that stand out to you?
Well, first of all, do they talk with each other?
So if they're ignoring the silent treatment is not a good thing.
Well, no. And there's so much I could say about that. I mean, the ways in which we deal with conflict is really critical to look at. There's a lot of work that needs to be done as individual people that impacts the way that we show up with our partners. So turning towards our partner rather than away from them when things get difficult is the goal. So that connection, that attachment, that place that both partners know that it's a safe place to be emotional, it's a safe place to feel frightened, it's a safe place to express frustration, and expressing it, though, in a regulated, safe way, if that makes sense.
And when it comes to things like your intimate life, what would like a healthy relationship look like there?
Well, it's interesting because intimacy happens on multiple levels. So if you're talking specifically about sexuality, both partners should feel safe. Both partners should feel like they can say no, that they're not interested in having sex, and that it'll be honored. Often interest in being sexual is tied to the safety of the relationship, ironically. If one person feels seen and respected and heard and honored in those day-to-day moments, then chances are they're going to feel more inclined to be sexually intimate and interested. Anytime somebody feels like they're being forced or that they have to have sex or they're being belittled or ridiculed, that's a problem.
Things like your social life or how family gets along.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because our family of origins will have opinions about our partners. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem with our partner. And yet, if we're hearing from our friends and the people who love us and who have known us for a while that they're concerned about the behavior of our partners, that might be something to be open to listen to wonder about. If we are concerned about what our partners might say or do in a public setting, or if we find that we're being told that we're not able to see this friend or this family member or call this friend or call this family member, then again, that's a red flag. That says that there's something going on, that there's an issue of control that needs to be addressed.
So yeah, if you're just kind of blocking social life, if you're blocking like interactions with people, that's not healthy, right?
Yeah. And especially if it's coming from your partner that this is what needs to happen. If you're finding that you're feeling more and more isolated and cut off, it's time to pay attention and to perhaps seek supports, which can be difficult to do if you're being told who to call and when.
But I guess on the flip side, if you're supporting your partner going out, having a social life, having other interests, and engaging with family, engaging with friends, that's really positive.
Absolutely. Our relationships offer this beautiful opportunity for connection and attachment. And yet we are individuals within a relationship. So our ability to foster friendships outside the relationship, to pursue interests and hobbies, to grow and to learn, even if our partner doesn't share the same interest, is really critical and allows us to actually show up in our relationships in a whole way, in a more holistic, present way where we feel like we're growing as individuals and able to bring that growth into the relationship.
When things come to the money side, money is a huge issue in a lot of relationships, talking about money and handling money. And I had even no idea that people would cut each other off like financially and limit their spending.
Well, it's really interesting. You're absolutely right, John. Money and financial issues are huge when it comes to our relationships with our partners. Each person will come from a different family of origin with different expectations around money, how it's spent, what you buy, how you save, when you save, all of that. And so the interface between one partner and another and the language around it and the experience and the values around spending can be quite different. So it becomes critical that people can communicate their needs, their values around money. And also when you're talking about red flags, if we start to see that the bank account is being emptied or, that you're being told when you can spend and how you can spend, then that's important to pay attention to. It's one thing to have a discussion around, hey, do you need this and do I need that? And it's a discussion. And as I talked about before, that people feel equal, that they have an equal sense of self and voice in that decision making. The moment somebody says, I make the decisions and you get this much money and you can't access anymore, then that's a problem. That reflects a deep level of control and can fuel that isolation that can happen in an unhealthy relationship.
So it's important people have a little bit of independence. Is that a healthy relationship would be just very supportive of people and their ability to have control of those sort of things, the trust?
Trust is huge. Thank you for bringing that up, because trust is a key part of that, relationship, and ties into the experience of finances and social connections, all of it. Having some freedom and yet being deeply connected and attached to our partners, which fosters that trust. It's the, being deeply connected, having the trust, having the sense of safety, and then allowing each other to grow and be dependent and to make decisions about what they'll spend money on that particular day. But again, big spending and things that impact the family as a whole, it's important to discuss that.
Yeah, I think definitely communication when it comes to spending money is probably absolutely key.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And involving both parties, definitely. When it comes to anger, what's a good way to express anger? It might be a challenging one, but is there a good model for being angry?
I think anger gets a really bad rap, to be honest with you. I feel
sweet. Let's all get angry.
Yeah. The reason why it gets a bad rap is, I believe, world according to Holly, that we think of it in its most extreme expression. So when it really does become damaging and painful to other people or ourselves, right? But anger in and of itself, which gets expressed in a whole variety of ways, tells us that it's time to pay attention to something. There's something underneath that anger. We call it a secondary emotion, because often it's reflecting feelings of fear or shame or feeling like we're losing power over something or control. Expressing anger, yes, becomes critical when we are in an intimate partner relationship, because if we don't learn about how we personally experience anger, there's a risk that we will use it in ways or experience it in ways that will impact our partner negatively. When we start to understand that there's a physiological aspect to anger, there's an emotional response, a psychological response, that it's all connected, then we're better able to process the experience and show up in a way that allows us to express what we're feeling without harming the other person psychologically or physically in the worst case.
Red flags when it comes to relationships. Is there anything that makes you go, yeah, something's wrong here?
It's an interesting thing that often people won't seek support around behaviors they're not happy about in themselves because of the shame factor, or when we hear that somebody's using anger or violence in a relationship, we automatically discount or judge that person or write them off, when in reality, we are a complex species. People are rarely all good or all black. We're all sorts of shades of gray. But when we're using our anger or our fear is motivating us to use power over others at the expense of others, it means it's time to get some support and help. And I wouldn't do this work if I didn't believe in my heart of hearts that people with support can make those critical changes. That being said, using violence in a relationship, whether it's psychological violence, whether it's emotional violence, whether it's sexual violence, physical violence, spiritual violence, using violence in a relationship is not okay. And one of the beliefs is, people might tell themselves is, well, if that person didn't, then I wouldn't have had to have done this thing. And yet it is never the other person's responsibility in terms of how we choose to show up and what we choose to do in that relationship. It is always our responsibility. So the change begins with us. So I'll say that little piece first, because I think it's really critical. I think if we're in a relationship and we're noticing that we're often uncomfortable, either psychologically, all those areas of life that I'm listing, if we are uncomfortable in any aspect of our relationship, if we have children and we're wondering, oh my gosh, how will my kids be impacted by this behavior or that? It is time to pay attention. It is time to look at what supports might be offered. I see in the work that I've done with people, and as a human being myself, most of us fear change more than we fear what we're actually experiencing. What's that analogy with the frog? That's a sad analogy. I don't know. Where we're in the warm water, it's lukewarm and it's being turned up, it's being turned up, it's being turned up. So it could be that we see behaviors, oh my gosh, my partner, after it's been a rough day and maybe they've had a drink or two, gets kind of yelly. And we justify that and say, well, it was a rough day, no wonder. And then we see, and what I've seen in my work and what research says is that things escalate, that it very rarely stays at a level, if we're seeing things that are making us feel deeply uncomfortable about our safety or the safety of others emotionally, psychologically, or physically, it rarely stays at this level. Chances are it may escalate into something more dangerous, more painful, more difficult, more impactful on the children. And make no mistake, children are impacted by the climate of the home.
Communication is a huge thing. What do you recommend to families? Or what do you recommend to couples when it comes to communication?
Oh, you're absolutely right, John. Communication is huge. Ironically, we often think that communication is all about the words that we say. And what I would say from my experience is that communication has so much more to do with how we're showing up, which requires some individual work. And what I mean by that is really understanding what it is we value as individuals, what's important to us, understanding what our personal boundaries are, what do we need to feel safe and comfortable, starting to figure out how to have empathy for another human being. How might they feel? What might that look like for them? This is all individual work we can be doing. We talked about anger, understanding our experience of anger, what happens in our nervous system, in our body, in our brain when we're experiencing anger, so that we know the signs of when we're feeling it and how to process it and what to do. All of that is critical to communication. Lastly, when we've sorted all that and we have an understanding of that experience, then we learn how to use words. How do we speak to our partner when the emotions feel big, when there's a vested interest, when there's a financial disagreement, for example, or a parenting disagreement? How do we speak to them in a way where we're not shutting them down or kind of getting their backs up or creating a situation where they're immediately feeling like they have to defend themselves? So that's important. People will throw things around like, oh, using I statements, but there's so much more to communication. I mean, if you think about it, most of our communication has nothing to do with words. It has to do with our tone, and our body language.
Yeah.
So I could say to my partner, oh, I love you. And if you were in the room with me, you would see that there was an eye roll. Perhaps you could hear kind of a snarky tone. I have not said I love you. I've said something entirely different, and my partner will have picked up on that. It's a whole other thing to say, I love you. Understanding how we're showing up, because we learn from our families of origin. We develop in our own lives, growing up through school, all these experiences we have. We learn ways of showing up that we think will keep us safe, that we think will get our point across, that we think will make sure that we're winning. Those experiences often come at the loss of connection in a relationship. So doing that individual work, you can do that with a counselor. You can find books. You can find resources online. There's a lot to support people's learning around communication.
So with iMessages, you'll example might be, you never wash the dishes. Mm-hmm. And rather than saying that, you might frame it of, when you do whatever action, it makes me feel this way. I think that's basically, I learned about it many, many years ago, but
Absolutely.
You just got to watch where you put people on the defensive.
Yes. Well, yeah, because, it's a bit of a paradigm shift. We're often scanning our relationships through the lens of, well, if this person did this and this person's displeasing me and this person never and this person. So imagine, somebody coming to you and saying, you never do the dishes. Well, one, it's a huge generalization and may or may not be entirely true. And the person's immediately going to want to defend themselves. When we claim the experience and we say, I'm feeling this way and here's what I need, then the other person, the possibility of them actually being open to hearing what you have to say and actually being interested in supporting you to meet those needs increases because they're not suddenly having to defend themselves. This ties back to communication. We're often listening to the other person and formulating our thoughts, formulating our responses, deciding how we're going to refute them, how we're going to prove we're wrong and they're right. But what if we didn't do that? And instead, because we really care about our partner and we love them, we stopped and we listened and we really tried to hear and understand what it was they were trying to say. And especially when there's big emotions, trying to express those big emotions, those places where we feel kind of tender and vulnerable, it's hard enough. If we're trying to express that, and then our partner is saying, well, I wouldn't if you didn't, and you always, we just close right up because we have to protect our hearts, right? And we have to defend ourselves at that moment.
Do you offer any tips for couples when it comes to communications?
As I said, my first tip is do the individual work, whether that's with a counselor, whether that's looking into communication. Do the individual work. And then as a couple, clearly I'm biased because I'm a counselor, but we talk about looking after our bodies all the time, eating healthy food, exercising, and yet we don't think about the work that it takes to maintain our mental well-being, our relationships, that also benefits from attention and from intention, a desire to make it healthier. And so seeking support through a counselor can be an excellent way to learn how to communicate, to have somebody there to support you through that process.
Well, what if I don't want to do that?
Oh, most people don't. You know why? Because it's highly vulnerable. It is a vulnerable place to step into.
Is there a place to start at home?
Yes. Starting at home, you can find books, and I believe we can list some books for you after this is finished. We can supply you with some books where you can start. You will find information online about communication, about healthy relationships. There's a lot. You can start with the CAF connection. We've got something called the Healthy Relationships Campaign. In particular, and I feel very strongly that this campaign reflects some important aspects of a healthy relationship, as well as, those things, as we talked about, the things to be looking at in a relationship that may mean added supports are needed.
Yeah, there's a lot of supports available through the Canadian Armed Forces, and we'll list those in the show notes. Is there anything else you would mention for couples when it comes to healthier relationships?
I think it's critical that we not take our relationships for granted. We start off choosing someone and we love them and we have that gushy oxytocin flow that makes life feel brighter and wonderful. And then real life hits, children, deployments, financial stresses, pandemics. It's really critical that we're prioritizing our relationships, that we're not taking them for granted, that we are learning how to churn towards one another, how to communicate with one another, how to have each other's back when it does get difficult. Because as difficult as a relationship can be, it brings love and joy. I often think that the things that are of the most worth in this life experience are not easily attained. The things that bring the most meaning usually require some work. Do the work. Put the work into your relationship. Prioritize your relationship. It's worth it. And yet, if you are unsafe, if you are emotionally, physically, sexually unsafe, there is support out there, and it can be frightening to reach out for support. But people like myself and many others are here to talk with you and talk you through what the process might look like for you and where you can find safety.
Thank you very much for your time, Holly.
Oh, it's my pleasure, John. Thank you.
Lots of great tip sheets and resources on healthy relationships at calfconnection.ca. If you ever need help, the Family Information Line, the Member Assistance Program, and your local MFRC are a few places to start.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Military Lifestyle. To learn more about this episode and to check out our other resources like the deployment app, go to esquimaltmfrc.com. A special thanks to Organized Sound Productions for bringing our idea to life. Please share this podcast with your military family or with someone living the lifestyle. Subscribe to The Military Lifestyle on your favorite podcast app. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you for listening.